Every person ever born on Easter Island traces back to one boat. Roughly 50 people, 2,300 miles from the nearest inhabited land. The most isolated settled island on Earth, the civilization that built the Moai, carved from volcanic rock and moved across miles of rugged terrain. At its peak, Easter Island supported between 10 and 15,000 people, an entire complex society. They all descended from a founding group small enough to fit in one canoe. In 2017, a landmark study sequenced ancient DNA from Rapa Nui skeletal remains for the first time. The samples came from pre-contact burials dating to the 12th through 17th centuries. These were individuals who lived and died before any European ship reached the island. Their DNA was purely Polynesian, and it told a story of extreme isolation. The genomes showed some of the longest runs of homozygosity ever recorded in a human population, longer than Sardinians, longer than Icelanders. Among the most extreme ever measured, population geneticists used these patterns to calculate the effective founding population size. The answer was consistent across multiple methods, roughly 50 individuals. The founders' DNA matched most closely with populations from the Marquesas and Mangrove Islands. The branch length confirmed a recent founding event, not a gradual colonization over centuries. The genetic date for the founding matched the archaeological evidence almost perfectly. Charcoal and bone from the earliest settlement layers dated to approximately 1100 CE. The first settlers brought a toolkit typical of Eastern Polynesian colonizers. Fishhooks, adzes, and obsidian flakes matched the tool traditions of the Eastern Polynesian homeland. Now agree. One voyage, one landing, around 1100 CE. Anakena Beach, the most sheltered landing point on the island, is where tradition says the first settlers arrived. Not 500, not 200, 50. One double-hulled canoe worth of people. To understand how 50 people became a civilization, you need to understand Polynesian voyaging. The Polynesians were the greatest open ocean navigators in human history. Beginning around 1500 BCE, they colonized every habitable island in the Pacific. They navigated by stars, ocean swells, cloud formations, and the flight patterns of seabirds. No instruments, no maps, only centuries of accumulated knowledge passed from navigator to apprentice. And around 1100 CE, a single canoe found the most remote island on Earth. These canoes were engineering marvels, 40 to 60 feet long, capable of carrying dozens of people and supplies for weeks. The navigators who found Easter Island would have read the stars, the swells, and the seabird patterns. They sailed towards stars they knew would rise over land, and they found an island no one had ever seen. The canoe would have carried food plants, breeding animals, and enough fresh water for weeks at sea. Sweet potato cuttings, taro rootstock, banana shoots, and sugarcane, the agricultural toolkit of colonization. They did not stumble onto Easter Island. They sailed, prepared to start a civilization from scratch. Finding a landing spot on Easter Island was itself a challenge. Most of the coastline is sheer volcanic cliff. Only a few sheltered bays offered safe anchorage. Anakena on the north coast was the most accessible. And around 1100 CE, a single canoe found the most remote island on Earth. These canoes were engineering marvels, 40 to 60 feet long, capable of carrying dozens of people and supplies for weeks. The navigators who found Easter Island would have read the stars, the swells, and the seabird patterns. They sailed towards stars they knew would rise over land, and they found an island no one had ever seen. The canoe would have carried food plants, breeding animals, and enough fresh water for weeks at sea. Sweet potato cuttings, taro rootstock, banana shoots, and sugarcane, the agricultural toolkit of colonization. They did not stumble onto Easter Island. They sailed, prepared to start a civilization from scratch. Finding a landing spot on Easter Island was itself a challenge. Most of the coastline is sheer volcanic cliff. Only a few sheltered bays offered safe anchorage. Anakena on the north coast was the most accessible. And around 1100 CE, a single canoe found the most remote island on Earth. Easter Island sits over 2,000 miles from the Marquesas, the nearest likely departure point. The voyage would have taken weeks in open ocean, with no guarantee of finding land. The genetic evidence suggests this voyage happened exactly once. One successful crossing. The mitochondrial DNA diversity on the island is extremely limited. only a handful of maternal lineages. If there had been multiple voyages, you would see more lineages. You do not. Y chromosome diversity tells the same story. Fewer paternal lineages than any other Polynesian population. The founding men carried perhaps 3 or 4 distinct paternal lineages at most. The quarry at Ranararaku was the single source of stone for nearly every moai on the island. Workers carved the statues using harder basalt picks. Thousands of discarded picks litter the quarry floor. Each statue took an estimated team of 6 people roughly 1 year to carve from the bedrock. Moving the completed statues to their final platforms required coordinated labor across the community. Recent experiments suggest the statues were rocked upright and walked along prepared roads using rope teams. The Ahu platforms themselves were massive engineering projects built from fitted stone blocks. Every one of these projects required community organization. And the community started with 50 people. Nearly 300 Ahu platforms ring the coastline. Each clan territory maintained its own monuments. From those few lineages, an entire civilization grew over roughly 500 years. Population modeling suggests the growth was rapid. The island's volcanic soil was fertile. Sweet potatoes, taro, yams, and chickens provided reliable food sources from the beginning. With abundant food and no competitors, the population could double every few generations. 50 people became 500 in a century, 5,000 in 3 centuries. The island was full, and they began building the monuments that would make this island famous. Nearly 900 moai were carved from the quarry at Ranararaku over roughly 3 centuries. Each one weighed between 10 and 80 tons. The largest unfinished example weighs over 200, all built by a population that descended from 50 founders and never received genetic reinforcement. No fresh DNA entered the pool. Everything they built came from that one crossing. But here is the twist. The genetic isolation had consequences the founders could never have predicted. Easter Island has the lowest genetic diversity of any Polynesian population ever studied. Low diversity does not mean genetic collapse. The population adapted. Recent studies have detected signatures of natural selection in the ancient Rapa Nui genome. Genes related to fat metabolism and insulin regulation show evidence of strong positive selection. On a small island with limited and seasonal food resources, the ability to store fat efficiently was a survival advantage. Natural selection favored individuals who could survive periods of scarcity on stored body fat. The founders' grandchildren evolved differently from their Polynesian cousins because their island demanded it. Allele frequencies for several metabolic genes diverged significantly from other Polynesian populations. The island diet shifted dramatically over time as forests disappeared and marine resources declined. Carbon and nitrogen isotopes from ancient bones show a gradual shift from seafood to sweet potato over centuries. The islanders developed lithic mulching, placing stones in their gardens to retain moisture and nutrients. This agricultural innovation allowed them to feed thousands on an island with no permanent streams. They adapted their genes, their diet, and their farming to survive on 63 square miles of rock. The chickens they brought from Polynesia became their primary protein source as fish stocks declined. DNA from ancient chicken bones confirmed they descended from the same Southeast Asian lineages found across Polynesia. The island's resources were finite, and when the population exceeded what the land could support, crisis came. Pollen cores from the island's crater lakes tell a devastating environmental story. When the Polynesians arrived, the island was covered in palm forest. Within centuries, every tree was gone. The now extinct Easter Island palm was related to the Chilean wine palm. It grew over 60 feet tall. The trees were cut for canoe building, house construction, rope making, and rollers for moving the moai. The genetic bottleneck trapped them on the island. And then deforestation took away their ability to leave. Without large trees, they could no longer build ocean-going canoes. The last connection to the outside world was severed. A population descended from 50 seafarers became permanently landlocked on a 63 square mile rock. The genetic consequences were measurable. As the population crashed from resource depletion, diversity dropped further. Genetic modeling suggests the population may have dropped to as few as 1 to 2,000 before European contact. A second bottleneck, The descendants of 50 founders were reduced again by their own success. But the genetic story does not end with the pre-contact collapse. European contact brought a third catastrophe. The first European visits brought smallpox, tuberculosis, and syphilis to a population with no immunity. With no prior exposure to old world diseases, the mortality rate was catastrophic. In 1862, Peruvian slavers kidnapped over 1,500 Rapa Nui, nearly half the population. Most died in Peruvian guano mines. Only 15 survivors were eventually repatriated. Those 15 survivors brought smallpox back with them. The epidemic killed most of who remained. By the 1870s, entire villages stood empty. The population had collapsed to barely over 100. The colonial bottleneck reduced genetic diversity even further than the original founding event. Ancient DNA from pre-contact burials preserves lineages that no living person carries today. In 1722, Dutch explorer Jacob Roggeveen became the first European to reach the island. Over the next century and a half, European diseases, Peruvian slave raids, and colonial violence devastated the population. By 1877, only 111 Rapa Nui remained alive on the island. 111. From 50 founders to a civilization of thousands, back to 111. The genetic bottleneck created by colonialism was even more extreme than the original founding event. Today, approximately 8,000 people live on Easter Island. Most identify as Rapa Nui, but the modern population carries the genetic scars of 3 successive bottlenecks. One of the enduring mysteries is the sweet potato. It originated in South America, but was growing on Easter Island before European contact. For decades, the sweet potato was cited as evidence that Rapa Nui voyagers reached South America. But the ancient DNA tells a different story. Pre-contact Rapa Nui genomes show no Native American ancestry. If the founders had stopped in South America before reaching Easter Island, their DNA would show it. The sweet potato arrived somehow, but the people who brought it did not mix with South Americans. The mystery of how the sweet potato crossed the Pacific remains one of the great unsolved questions in Pacific archaeology. The genetic evidence is clear on one point. The founders came from Polynesia, not from South America. Thor Heyerdahl's famous Kon-Tiki hypothesis that Easter Island was settled from South America has been definitively disproven by DNA. Modern Rapa Nui genomes show significant European and some Native American admixture from post-contact mixing. The pre-contact samples are critical because they preserve the original founding signal before dilution. Without ancient DNA, we could never have measured the founding bottleneck accurately. Modern DNA is too mixed. The Rapa Nui people have maintained their cultural identity despite the genetic upheaval. Their language, their oral traditions, and their undeciphered Rongorongo script all survive in some form. Modern archaeological projects on Easter Island now involve Rapa Nui community members as full partners. The descendants of those 50 founders are now reclaiming their ancestors' story. The Rapa Nui language is being taught to a new generation after nearly disappearing in the 20th century. Fewer than 4,000 people speak Rapa Nui today. Language preservation is as urgent as genetic study. The annual Tapati Festival celebrates traditions that trace directly back to the founding culture. Traditional carving, dance, and chanting have been revived by community cultural programs. In 2017, the Rapa Nui community gained greater control over their ancestral land and archaeological sites. Self-governance of heritage sites means the descendants now decide who studies their ancestors' bones. The same community that started with 50 people now protects the legacy that those 50 created. Some Moai have had their coral eyes restored. For the first time in centuries, the ancestors are watching again. The Rapa Nui language is being taught to a new generation after nearly disappearing in the 20th century. Fewer than 4,000 people speak Rapa Nui today. Language preservation is as urgent as genetic study. The annual Tapati Festival celebrates traditions that trace directly back to the founding culture. Traditional carving, dance, and chanting have been revived by community cultural programs. In 2017, the Rapa Nui community gained greater control over their ancestral land and archaeological sites. Self-governance of heritage sites means the descendants now decide who studies their ancestors' bones. What this ultimately tells us is that genetic bottlenecks do not prevent civilization. 50 people with limited genetic diversity built one of the most recognizable monument traditions in human history. They carved stone, developed a unique script, and sustained a complex religious system for 5 centuries. Genetic diversity does not determine cultural achievement. 50 founders proved that on a volcanic rock in the Pacific. The Moai still stand. The descendants of the founders still live on the island, 2,300 miles from anywhere, built by the children of one canoe. If you appreciate stories where genetics rewrites what we thought we knew, subscribe, drop a comment. Could you build a civilization starting with 50 people and nothing else?